Welcome to a Simple Therapy podcast. Real conversations, brave stories, and simple, soulful insights for therapists and anyone on a healing journey. I'm Sindee Gozansky, licensed therapist, supervisor, and a fellow human figuring it out too. Around here, we believe healing doesn't have to be complicated, and that leading with your heart still matters. We talk about what it really means to be human in and out of the therapy room. You'll hear from therapists, mental health professionals, and people courageously sharing their personal healing journeys. Because whether you're the therapist or the client, we're all human here. Let's keep it simple and keep showing up. Hello and welcome to a Simple Therapy podcast. I'm Sindee Gozansky, your host, and I already know that this is going to be one of the most important episodes of this year because we're asking this question: how do we advance mental health practices to meet the needs of a diverse world and honor differences? Well, my guest today, José Rosario, is truly making this his life's work. José is a therapist, human rights speaker, scholar, and above all, an advocate. Born to young Puerto Rican parents, José developed cerebral palsy as a premature baby. His family tried navigating various systems in their fight toward equity, and the judgment José faced had a big impact on his mental health. Fast forward to 2017, he started sharing his experience as a Latino gay man who uses a wheelchair. He founded the nonprofit, the Phoenix Unbound, to amplify and support the mental health journeys of those in the BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, and disability communities. His focus is on creating safe mental health spaces for minoritized people and those with intersectional identities. His research focuses on the impact of hate-based violence and cultural trauma on intersectional communities and how they engage in radical healing in response. And he's on track to complete his PhD in clinical psychology in May of 2026. There is so much more, and I'm going to let José tell his story. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. That bio is so long, and every time I hear it, I think there's not enough coffee in the world to just kind of get through those moments. So I really appreciate your kindness as you introduced me.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's so deserved. And no shame, I had coffee before we started recording.
I've been drinking coffee since I was 6. At this point, it's a part of my day-to-day practice.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, we have that affinity. There's so much about you, and we want to dive into your work and your passion and your advocacy. But let's start with your lived experience because it's unique and you're very open and vulnerable in sharing about it.
Yeah, especially throughout my training, I've been thinking a lot about how this is not the norm, right? I think I come from a world where originally I was trained to be the blank slate, right? The tabla rasa of therapy, right? We don't share who we are. We don't bring that into the room. And that's changed. And I think for me, that change ended up being crucial because I find that the only way that I can practice is really centering the experience of minoritization, the experience of systems, and my empathy for that comes from my own experience, right? And so if I separate myself from my work, I think the clients, they suffer, right? Because they're not getting a person who can say, oh, that's really hard. And it's something that you're navigating that maybe can't change right now. And so where do we kind of sit in that dichotomy of suffering and wanting change?
I love it. Yeah. I love it. And right back at you, I also supervise, master's level students, and I encourage them, forget what the university says, with all due respect, you have to bring some of yourself into the room. You have to be real. And, I love how you say your differences help you create that and feel that empathy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think they make it fun. And I think playfulness, especially now in my development as a therapist, I've really been thinking a lot about play and bringing humor and also lightness to the work, right? Because mental health and suffering and pain, especially these days, can be quite dark and quite heavy. And I think making space for both. And of course, use of self is a skill, and we have to make sure we're doing that appropriately. But there is some sort of dance that happens in therapy to allow you to connect with each other.
Very near and dear to my heart. Yeah. So you mentioned play. Let's go back a little. I imagine you experienced having a disability like as a kid, probably in school, and it impacted you and like your ability to play and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's so interesting you bring that up. I actually haven't talked about this on a podcast yet, but recently I kind of came to the realization that as an adult, I'm having to learn how to play all over again, because as a kid, I had limited mobility, or at least more limited than I do now. And so my experience of play was different, right? I couldn't do things like jump rope or jump on a trampoline. And so I really fell in love with reading and immersing myself in fantasy worlds. And that became my way of play. And now as an adult with some more mobility, but just more access to support, figuring out what that means for me as a person. How do I want to play? I think it's an example of difference. And you mentioned being different, and that was a theme in my life. And I, as a kid, really struggled with this sense of being different from somebody else. And I've learned that that's because we teach children and we teach people that being different is inherently negative, when in reality, it's a strength. As I'm sure you know, supervising trainees, it's like, bring that difference into the room. It creates novelty. It creates a potential for a new perspective.
And you've done a TEDx talk, which is amazing, and we'll link to that. And it is about difference and how we do all have differences, whether they're as transparent or not. I guess embracing difference can be really hard. Mm-hmm. You've been able to do that. Maybe like share a little bit about all of these differences of yours that you've embraced, and then they inform your work today.
In the spirit of being real, I have to acknowledge that embracing these differences was not an easy process, right? Mm-hmm. I very much remember that little boy who would sit in his closet and cry and be like, why me? Why did God have to make me this way? Why did the universe have to make me this way? What's wrong with me? And all of those really self-judgmental, self-critical messages, right? About the fact that I couldn't walk or that I couldn't be like everyone else. And I really struggled because there were ways in which the system really reinforced that message for me. And I think of two examples that I talk about all of the time. One being when I was about 6 years old, a doctor said to my parents right in front of me, your child's not going to accomplish anything. You'll be lucky if he's not a vegetable. Like, you might as well just give up. And so those words, hearing them as a young child, were really impactful, right? Because they reinforced this narrative of there was no hope, and that there were already limitations being placed on my journey, on my purpose. And so it was just a way in which it reinforced that why me statement. And again, navigating school, right? And navigating resources, that was also a struggle. And so every time we would encounter one of those systemic moments, it would reinforce that my disability in and of itself was the thing that everybody saw first.
Yeah. And, as you say that, even a 6-year-old boy who may not be so nuanced in understanding what the doctor said, you knew full well, and you saw the impact it had on your parents. And that's really big.
And the impact on me, right? Because I remember being angry and being maybe a touch defiant, and just being like, I don't want to do physical therapy. I don't want to stretch. I don't want to do the things that were good for me, because why would I? What was the point, right? It was sort of like this hopelessness. And my parents, being who they are, we call it the Puerto Rican fire, right? Connecting back to our indigenous roots of resilience and resistance. Mom in particular would always tell me, you can't give up if you haven't tried. And that was the message that she had for me all my life. And it was the message that I hold today. I have to at least try.
Yeah, so beautiful. And you shared this, how your parents were really your first examples of activists in their care of you.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much they claim the term activist, but I think that they are certainly activists in their own right. I often start every talk by naming the fact that my parents were young when they had me. They were in their early 20s, late teens, and they were figuring out what it meant to be adults. And they were in a place where they had come to Connecticut from Puerto Rico and didn't speak English, didn't understand the healthcare system. And then they had a premature baby, right? And there's no instruction manual for having a premature child. And so they had to contend with a system telling them that they weren't good enough, that they could have put me up for adoption if they wanted to, that they didn't have to do this. And my parents made choices in those moments to stay with me and to say that this is their baby and that they're going to keep fighting this fight. So for us, that was their moment to me that they became activists because they saw the system and resisted. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. Kudos to them. Such a huge shout out and honoring of them. I love that.
They're pretty cool, I have to say. But they're stubborn, but so am I.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think that's such a great quality.
I think so too. Yeah.
Yes. And so, Jose, you're sharing with us, right? Your culture, that's a difference. You know, being multilingual, that's a difference. Your disability, there are other things too. And with that, you created the Phoenix Empowered, which I love the name. It's so cool. I want to share a quote that you said about the Phoenix Empowered. My job is to amplify the mental health stories of all of the voices of minoritized communities and then do something about what we're hearing, provide education, provide training. That doing something, I love that. Tell us about this amazing nonprofit.
Wow. First of all, I can't believe I said that, but
you did.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'll start by being a little nerdy about the name, if that's okay. You know, it was intentional. I believe that we have a narrative in the United States, but maybe even globally, right? We have this narrative of like, pick yourself up from your bootstraps and like really dust yourself off and keep going. And we expect people to rise from the ashes, which is a beautiful sentiment. But I believe personally that with minoritized communities, we are missing a piece of the puzzle. We can't ask people to rise from the ashes if you've been told, like I was in various moments of my life, time and time again, that you're not good enough, that you can't do something. The more that we invalidate, the more it's going to take a lot of time and healing to rise up from the ashes. And so the Phoenix Empowered is the sort of cue that we have to empower people to rise if we want them to. And so that's where the name comes from. And it's something that has really stuck with me all of this journey since 2017 on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's great. And it's a beautiful logo. Also, we've got to give a shout out to your whole team. It's really got that unity. And I think that also speaks to what you're trying to create.
Yeah. And I really appreciated that the doing something resonates with you. And, you know, we talked for just a few minutes offline, and I can see the synergy here. I can see that you understand how important the work is that we do as therapists, as healers, as people who have dedicated our lives to sitting with people in maybe some of their darkest moments. I just believe that when people share their pains with us, we have a responsibility to not just go, they're there and hand them a tissue, but rather we work with people, right, to change the systems that they live in. And this gets into a much larger conversation about like, what is the goal of a therapist engaging in therapy with a client? Because I think for me, our goals are changing when we think about doing things. It's not just symptom reduction anymore. It's not just coping. It's now changing systems and engaging in healing instead of coping is where I sit on the continuum right now.
Yeah, I'd love for you to expand on that. I think that's so important.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been talking about this a lot as I'm ending my training and getting towards the end of this PhD. I've been talking a lot to other folks in the field about this idea of, are we really asking people to cope? And is that always effective? I don't believe in living in extremes of always or never. And so, yes, sometimes we do need to reduce symptoms, right? Like panic symptoms. If you're experiencing panic attacks, it is horrendous. And yes, we absolutely want to reduce that. And we have another job to do, right? If somebody is experiencing, for example, food insecurity, or they're unhoused, and there's all of these complexities or co-occurring circumstances that somebody's facing, I can't ask you to cope with your anxiety, and then you're still coping with all of these systemic issues. And so that's where I think coping doesn't necessarily meet the mark. I believe that we have to work with clients to figure out what can you do in your life to change the system that you're in. And if there's not something that you can directly do, how do we at least connect you to supports? How do we connect you to people? Because no one heals in isolation.
Exactly. There's percent. I agree with that. And I see the need, right? How can somebody has no natural supports or feels that they are isolated or have other barriers like you talked about? How can they really even address their mental health when there's so many other issues? And then to add in discrimination, oppression, microaggressions, racism, all of those things.
Absolutely. And we weren't trained to talk about these things. We're not trained to talk about oppression. We're not trained to talk about the fact that there is a housing crisis and a lack of nutritious food for specific communities, which, by the way, may or may not be intentional, right? If we think about comorbidities. And so there's complexity here that as therapists, we're being forced to navigate in the current political and socio-political moment. And so we have to figure out how are we going to hold all of the pieces of our clients? That's our responsibility.
Right. And sometimes it doesn't look like therapy. And I think that's what's really hard sometimes for newer therapists to grasp.
Yeah. Therapy can be so beautiful. And I think that's part of the reason why is that no session is going to look like the textbook. It's just not how it works in practice. It's fluid and it's moving. And I love being a clinician. I think my heart is with accompanying people. That's the greatest joy of my life.
Yeah, accompanying. So nice. Yeah. So the Phoenix Empowered, what do you guys do there?
Yeah. So I travel and I do a lot of keynotes around the intersection of mental health and identity, talking specifically about the experiences of oppression and systemic violence and hate-based violence. And, you know, I interject parts of my story because I believe it's important to name the lived experiences, that I'm not just talking about racism or ableism or even heterosexism as like these foreign concepts. Like these are things that are being experienced by me and by so many others intersectionally. And so a lot of my work has been to create dialogue around this notion that mental health is complicated and is not one size fits all. And we have to think about how people are experiencing systemic racism and other forms of oppression and how that impacts mental health. And because I never wanted this to be the Jose show, we've also expanded beyond keynotes, and we do a lot of training. And so we have a mental health literacy program called Empowered Spaces, where we teach providers how to talk about oppression and hate-based violence and how to incorporate tenets of what we call, or what the field calls, radical healing. And so that's a lot of the mental health literacy that we do. And we've started doing radical healing fireside chats for young people. We've started other types of workshops as well. And so a lot of our work these days is more consultation, education, and training.
Fascinating. That's so cool. What's like an example or two, like a more concrete example of, like you said, training therapists or providers to be more aware of the oppression?
Yeah, what a great question. I think I'm going to start by just explaining radical healing, because I know I talk about it a lot. And it's, so I want to break it down a little bit. So first and foremost, I have to name the framework of radical healing comes from incredible scholars and healers of color who have been doing this work longer than I have. And they came together to say, you know, communities of color in particular have been healing for a long time. And so what do we know about how communities of color heal that can help us understand how to support individual and collective level trauma? And many of us have come into this and have said, okay, let's think about intersections. What about queer people of color? What about, non-binary? And thinking about the ways in which intersections make this more complicated. But in essence, radical healing has 5 components. Healing engages with becoming aware of systemic oppression, having a name for it, developing what we call critical consciousness of systemic oppression. Can I name it? Can I talk about it? What do I ability is to confront a system What can I do to change my system? All of that is a part of that first pillar of critical consciousness. We also believe in strength and resistance. People have the power to engage in resistance, and folks have been engaging in resistance for generations. I mean, I mentioned very briefly, but I come from Puerto Rico, and we have the Taino indigenous tribe that has a history of fighting for the island, fighting against colonization. And, that fire, I believe, lives in all of us on the island and from the island. So strength and resistance. We talk a lot about collectivism. There's power in community. We can come together and be together. And that's how we heal, by having collective movements. We talk about cultural authenticity, right? Things like engaging in cultural practice, whether it be prayer, whether it be drumming, whether it be dancing or food, and finding a way to connect back to this bigger piece of yourself. And then finally, radical hope is our fifth pillar, where we have to have hope in spite of what's happening around us. And that's the radical piece, is like, can you have hope even though things are happening around you that are painful? And so these 5 pillars guide everything that we do as a team. And so we talk to folks about, can we just talk about oppression? Can we just ask the question like, hey, it sounds like this is also extending beyond you, because one of the steps of healing is being able to separate the individual blaming themselves for the system's problem. And so teaching mental health professionals, can we at least start to poke at, this sounds like it could be racism. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Mm-hmm. Can we identify that trauma maybe isn't just an individual experience? It's more of an individual and collective experience. And so how do we connect them to community supports? I firmly believe that part of what we need to do is be out in the community.
Yes, right. That's a very missing piece. Being mm-hmm. out in the community, being seen, not hiding any of those things that you just talked about, different identities that so often have to be hidden.
Yeah, for sure. And that goes, I guess, for us and for our clients, right? Being authentic in ourselves too, when we can and when it's appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. The psychology of radical healing is in my notes.
Great papers. I recommend it. They're some incredible humans, and having met quite a few of them, they're wonderful people as well. So.
Yeah. And the framework, it feels like healing itself, even as you described it. Oh, and then with that, the pillars and having hope there really seems so encouraging.
Yeah. I always say radical healing found me, not the other way around, because full disclosure, I was in a place where I was questioning whether or not I could be in this field, where I was questioning if the way that I saw the world because of my lived experiences, if I could fit into this mold of what a therapist could be, because I was feeling tired after the 2020 reckoning that was happening and a global pandemic, and questioning whether or not the kind of liberatory work I wanted to do could be done in our field. And then somebody said, have you heard about this framework called radical healing? And I read the paper, and it just really resonated with the fact that I really appreciate being in community, the fact that I want to hold pieces of myself gently, and how I always tell people, like, I come from the fiery Taino tribe. I come from folks who crawled up the steps of the Capitol building to fight for disability rights. I come from the queer activists. Like, these are the communities I come from. And all of that being connected in this framework really cemented for me that we are out there doing this work. Liberation and healing and resistance is possible.
Yeah. Strength and resistance. Yes, that's so powerful. It's such a legacy that you're continuing.
I sure hope so. That's the goal, right? Is to honor the people who come before us and to pave the path for those who come after.
Yeah. So connected with that, you really encourage people to dream, to be who they are and live into their potential. Does that connect with this concept of radical healing?
Absolutely, right? If we think about just the cultural authenticity pillar and connecting back to roots, part of that is, do we encourage people, right, to find spaces in the community that allow you to connect back to these pieces of yourself, whether it's a queer book club, or I had a client recently say, I'm really passionate about racial equity. And so could they find a community organization to volunteer with? And I think that's a huge part of healing, is living into your personhood, recognizing the fact that we all hold so many identities, right? That intersectionality piece to me is what makes this work so fun, is that we all have so many lived experiences that we often discredit. And we have to think about how does it create the mosaic of who the person is?
Yeah, I love that image, the mosaic. Did you know 1 in 5 people will experience a mental health issue this year? That's why I created Mental Health Threads, to spread awareness and break the stigma around mental health. At mentalhealththreads.etsy.com, you'll find a collection of inspiring and fun products, from t-shirts and hoodies to mugs, hats, candles, and more, all featuring positive messages that encourage self-care and mental well-being. Best sellers like Go to Therapy, Love Wins, and Still Here are fan favorites, along with our signature semicolon designs and Pride collection. Therapists especially love our exclusive items like Licensed Listener and Professional Secret Keeper. Our mission is to spark important conversations and remind you that you are not alone. If you're ready to make a statement and support mental health, head on over to mentalhealththreads.etsy.com today. Let's make mental health a priority together. Jose, as we're talking about this, something's coming up for me, like thinking about first responder who goes on the scene and checks the scene for safety. Is it okay to like enter and then do their thing? And as you talk about somebody who wants to be authentic in their community, how do we check the scene and know it's going to be safe for us to show up fully?
I think the hard part here, for those of you who are listening and who are also therapists, I think you might also be thinking this, is that there's a part of the equation that's outside of our control. It really depends on the other person doing the work to show that we are safe, particularly, right, when you're from a minoritized community and there's this embedded mistrust from history. And so I think we have work to do to make others feel safe and to always be learning and growing so that we can continue to make folks feel safe when we misstep. But I think in terms of checking the scene, one of the things that I encourage people to do is to be radically authentic. Don't hide who you are and your thoughts. And if there's a cue that it doesn't feel safe in that space, then maybe that's not the space that you belong in, but you deserve to be wherever you're going to be in your fullness if you can do so safely. And so I think that authenticity is important to kind of test the waters. And I think finding your collective, right? Finding the people who can test these spaces with you. Whether that be, I'm going to go to this new grocery store because I moved to a new town. Okay, can you find someone to come up with you and go to the grocery store? Or there's Meetup, which is this online platform to meet people. Can we find things that we might be interested in to really start to develop a network? There's power in the collective.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And really finding those affinity groups that may be so nuanced that then they speak to that person's identity.
Yeah. I study queer BIPOC violence, and a lot of what I hear is community spaces, advocacy spaces, they can't just cater to queerness and they can't just cater to the Latine or BIPOC identity. They need to cater to the fact that we are so much more than one thing, right? We are a complicated picture of experiences. And if you erase one, then you're failing that community.
And with all of this, the trauma exists at the individual level, at the generational and collective level. And so people are also navigating, we hold our trauma and enter these spaces.
Absolutely. And maybe part of it is recognizing that you belong in that space, that you deserve to be in that space. And I wonder if that's something we're always working on as folks who have experienced systemic invalidation. I know I have to make a conscious effort to be like, hey, no, you belong in this space. That imposter syndrome can be quite real. Going into a space and talking about mental health and identity, especially with folks who were not trained in this more liberatory model, but recognizing no, you belong in this space. You're needed in this space. We need people, those of you listening who have passions about social justice or community action, we need you and you belong.
Yeah. And take that advice that your mother gave you, right? You've got to try.
Yeah. She still holds me to that every single day.
Oh my gosh. Go, Mom.
Yeah, she's pretty cool.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. So we're touching on this notion of community, how important it is. We've seen community and groups such a big part of PTSD recovery, that's important, so important in many different types of therapeutic approaches. The idea of caring for our own communities, that's another mission of yours. Like, we join the communities and we also have to care for them.
Absolutely. And I think that in and of itself is why I think therapy can be crucial for us too. As members of the community, serving our community, we also need to process the experiences that we're holding, right? And so as I'm doing trauma work with people of color, or as I'm doing trauma work with queer folks, I have to be mindful. A lot of what I'm hearing is their experience, but there are some similarities that I need to be keeping in check. And so being in my own therapy, an important part of that process, and reminding myself that this is why I'm here, is to give back and to serve people across the spectrum, right? Whatever that may look like. But that's the work I get to do, not that I have to do. And so that's the framing that I go into this with.
Yeah. And if you're listening and not watching, I mean, Jose pretty much smiles the whole time he's talking about this, which is so loving and moving. And as you say that, it's a calling and it's on your heart. And it sounds like it also comes from a really just strong personal and maybe even faith-based approach that you have, that you're there to serve and you have this desire and a calling to do that.
Yeah. Although as we're talking, I'm also reflecting that like it took some work to get to this place, right? It took some healing to get to this place before I could do so, because I do think the trap that a lot of young therapists fall into is this idea of I'm going to save everyone as though they're going to save themselves. And we have to step away from that narrative. And so I had to really reconcile and sit with, what did it feel like to feel so different? And how do I heal from that before I could do this work? And for me, that really started in 2017 when I claimed my story for the first time, which happened on a stage. I don't even know how, in what world I thought that it would be cool that the first time I ever thought about my story in its totality would be in front of hundreds of people. But that's what happened. And it shifted something inside of me. It really made me see the journey. And it made me see, oh, there were some really hard moments that, by the way, not only I experienced, because so many people tell me, oh, that reminded me of this thing that happened to me or to my neighbor, to my sibling. It's a reminder that I'm a part of a larger narrative and that these events are part of my larger narrative. They're not the whole narrative. And so for me, that was a huge part of my healing process. And I'm very lucky that I've been able to use that as the fuel to really engage in activism. I still pinch myself. I can't believe this is my life sometimes.
Wow. Yes. You get lots of stages now.
Wild. Who would have thought?
Yeah.
Not me.
That's so great. And it's more than that too, because I know you see how you touch people, you interact with people in the audience, you talk to the ones who are moved or crying or want to speak with you afterwards. Like, you're just so human and real.
Thank you. And I think I've been very lucky that in a virtual world, we've been able to reach people all over the world, which has been so cool to be able to do work in English and Spanish and to get to hear people's stories and their stories, right? The people that I've been so fortunate and blessed to meet, they're the reason these trainings exist. They're the reason we keep developing trainings. What people are sharing with us, it's almost like doing an ongoing needs assessment in different places. I mean, I was in North Dakota recently and was mind blown with the kinds of work that they're wanting to do, that they're trying to do. There are students there that didn't even know about queerness and needed to be educated on queerness and identity. And it was a really beautiful moment to see where the need was. And so that's just one of hundreds of examples of things that have been made so clear from just getting to engage with people. And I think that's a lesson to us as therapists, that if we listen, things will unveil themselves, right? Those treatment plans, clients often already have their treatment plan. We just need to listen for it.
So good. Yeah. And this is the storytelling that's at the heart of what you do. Storytelling is really at the heart of the Phoenix Empowered.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say before anything else, I think I'm a storyteller, because I think across all of my different identities, that is the thing that remains true. And what's really cool is that I'm sort of transitioning into a space in my life and in my career where, yes, I'm telling my story and I think that's wonderful, but I'm also thinking a lot about how do we tell other stories? How do we create spaces for other people? And that's where we are re-energizing or reforming our podcast. It's coming back with a whole new light. And that's one of our many initiatives that we're working on right now to really create a space where we can amplify other people. Because my story is just one of thousands of stories that need to be told.
Yeah, that's cool. So tell everybody about your podcast, The Phoenix Unbound.
Phoenix Unbound. Yeah, I really like the Phoenix phrasing here. Yeah. The Phoenix Unbound is a podcast that really was built and constructed for a space to really have raw and unfiltered mental health conversations that I may not have with a client, right? Where we're talking about what's happening in the current world or current events and talking about how that impacts mental health. We call it Unbound because it's going to be bold and unfiltered. And we did our first season in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. And I'm going to be honest, it was really powerful and really educational and really fun, but it was dry. It was academic. And so I had to take a step back from it for a little while and really think about how do we make this a community-centered space? How do we make this a space where we can show more humanity and step away from the academic? Because I think I had reverted back to that part of myself and it lost the realness, the humanity. And so we're coming back. I have a new co-host who's also a team member at TPE and is one of my best friends. And we're just having conversations about what's happening in the world. And it's just as powerful, but way more fun. And so it'll be out in just a couple of weeks in the fall. And so around November, keep your eyes out because the Phoenix Unbound is coming back.
Excellent. Congratulations on that. We'll have to talk afterwards because I'm a huge fan of mental health journeys and have some ideas of my own. So,
oh, I love this. Yes, please. Absolutely. Yeah. I want to create spaces where people feel safe, where they can feel connected, where folks can say, oh, you've been through that. I've been through that, because it was so impactful for me after every talk to hear people's reactions. And I think more people would really benefit from creating community. So we're really thinking about how do we use different platforms, whether they be a blog or a podcast, which are things we already have, but we're revamping. How do we use these spaces to create connection? That's our goal in this new, I'm going to call it a new chapter, because it feels like the Phoenix Empowered is on like the cusp of really leveling up and we're ready. So it's exciting.
That's great. Yes. Let's welcome that new chapter. I've got to say too, Jose, I mean, it makes sense because you're so good in both worlds, in the academic as well as the community grassroots.
Well, that means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. So I can see how you might go back and forth a little bit.
Certainly. Yeah. I could definitely lean one way or the other. Now I'm trying to really own a blend. I'm trying to own that I can be a scholar and I can be a human. I don't have to choose one or the other.
Yeah. We need more. We need more like you.
I would say we're both in the same camp, my friend. I think there is, again, a synergy here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm so interested in these topics and even cultural competency and disability awareness. Taught a little bit at our local university on like multicultural competencies. And it's kind of a joke because it was an online class. How do we have experiences in the community in an online class? It deserves so much more than that. And I'm really concerned how therapists can learn cultural competency to support what you're talking about, these intersectional identities.
Yeah. And I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm excited to dialogue because I've also been questioning whether or not competency is even a relevant concept, right? I know that social work in particular has really spearheaded the movement towards cultural humility and this idea that we're always learning, always growing, and that it's an iterative process. And I certainly lean more that way. But I also think we have to call on therapists to actively do the work, to actively confront discomfort, to name racism, to name systemic oppression. I have a mug that says mental health is political. Because a lot of what I hear folks say is like, we can't get political. And yet, lack of healthcare, lack of housing, discrimination, violence, all of these things involve psychological well-being, right? They are directly correlated. And so I think this narrative of we can't think about the socio-political, socio-cultural context is false. I think it's kept us safe in the ivory tower for a very long time. And it's not going to work anymore. I mean, Gen Z, this new generation, and Gen Alpha, they're pushing us to be better. They're pushing us to be like, no, you do need to know these things. You do need to move this way. And so I think you're right. I don't think an online or even just a cultural competence course is enough, but we need constant supervision and consultation. And I confronted this thing and I didn't know what to do. And so what do you think? And dialogue. Yeah. I think our colleagues are our best resource.
Yeah. Bring someone in from the community. And so we're dishing a little academically here, but I would agree with you 100%. Competency, we do not purport to be experts as therapists. We're collaborative. We accompany, to take your word. So how are we going to say we're competent instead of learning or in the process or being curious? Maybe cultural curiosity or cultural humility.
Yeah, absolutely. Curiosity, humility, even cultural activism, right? Because even as allies, we have a possibility for activism. I can't understand every human being's experience, but I'm definitely going to try. And I'm going to continue to try because that's what we're called to do. That's our ethical responsibility as healers.
Yeah. And there's also the internal biases that we need to look at, which I think you alluded to, right? How can we start to move into places where we might not feel comfortable? And as a therapist, I think that's really important. Back with that. So for me, I think that's very important in training new people in the field of mental health or caregiving or even just healthcare in general to start to expand into that. You don't have to be in your comfort zone because you're not going to help if you stay there.
Right. Challenge yourself. You can't say you can't do it if you haven't tried, to borrow from my mom. And, recognize and just wanting to name for the audience, there is a difference between making yourself uncomfortable and feeling unsafe. Obviously, that's not what we're saying. But I do think there's benefit to expanding your worldview and always thinking about that as like a lifelong process. What else can I learn about the world that we live in? What else can I learn about other people and their experiences? I mean, that's a question that could guide us for a long time, I think.
Yeah. And thanks for that clarification. Very important. We're not talking about lack of safety here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Feeling safe. Yeah.
If it comes screaming slurs at you, like that is not okay. But it is okay to sit with a client's maybe discomfort or different political ideologies and sitting with, okay, how do I find the humanity here? That can be a really useful tool, especially right now in this current moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're recording in September 2025. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, I appreciate you placing us in time because next week it'll be a whole different world.
Right. Yeah. So, Jose, one other thing I hope we can talk about before we run out of time is just disability advocacy and awareness. And as a person with a disability, you've been confronted probably your whole life with like deficit model. How do we move away from that?
Yeah. My identity as a disabled person has gone through a lot of chapters, iterations, evolutions. For context, I have cerebral palsy, and so I walk with two canes or I use a wheelchair. That's how I get around in the world. Younger, it was more severe, right? I had more limited mobility. And so it took time and surgeries and a lot of work to get to this place. But like I said, throughout my life, I've kind of danced with that identity a little differently. At the beginning, it was certainly a deficits model and you're not good enough. Let's just call it what it is, right? It's comments like, hey, I didn't invite you to that party because my house has stairs and I didn't think you would come. Or feeling isolated in that way. It's, like I said, medical invalidation, which happens. And that was very difficult and really hard on my self-esteem, especially as it intersected with my queerness and being like, I want to date and I want to be in relationships and who's going to date the guy in the wheelchair, right? And that sort of narrative that builds up. And so I would say the first chunk of my life, it really was there's something missing. There's a deficit. You're not enough. Interestingly, though, my relationship to disability almost went the exact opposite direction in college, and especially after I started speaking, where I think people expected me to speak for the disability community. They would say things like, it's so great that you're doing these things, and I would be reduced to only my disability. It was like all anyone wanted me to talk about. It was all that people focused on. I have a memory, my last year of high school, I did this huge activism project where I brought in some money for a youth intervention protocol. And during the end of the event, after 8 months of work and raising thousands of dollars, somebody thanked me because I got up in the morning and got dressed. A political figure was like, can we just acknowledge how great it is that Jose got up and got dressed this morning? And that has always stuck with me as an example of reduction. And so for a while, I thought, you know what, Jose, if people want to reduce you to this, good, teach them something. But then 2020 hit and we had this racial reckoning. People were really thinking about identity. And I was getting hired left and right to be the token DEI speaker. And I was miserable and I was tired and I felt like I was going into communities and I would give a talk, but then there was like no follow through. And so I couldn't really see the change happening, couldn't really hold with people how to move forward. And so I made a choice in that moment that I wasn't going to be a disability speaker or a Latino speaker or even a queer speaker. I was going to be a human rights activist. That is who I am. I'm an intersectional human with all of my pieces. And if I'm going to do this work, if I'm going to commit to doing a talk, I'm also going to commit to bringing all of that and staying connected to the people I serve. And so when I do a talk, I always say, call me anytime. It is an open door. And so the way that I have shifted my view of disability really correlates to how I see my self-worth and how I see who I am. That was a long answer, but hopefully you all found that entertaining.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And really guiding, I think so guiding for us. And with that, changes my concluding questions, right?
Flexibility. We love it.
Well, exactly. That's what we need. That's part of the lesson here. I'm thinking about takeaways for therapists listening and also for general listeners. But for therapists, we have some constrained practices and we get in ruts. And so what would you say to the therapist working with people that have intersectional identities? How can they be more human rights focused?
I think it comes back to where we started, which is, can you play with the way that you deliver psychotherapy, with the way that you think about healing? If you feel like you're in a rut, people have been healing for generations. In 2023, I was at the American Psych Association's conference, and the president at the time, Dr. Bryan, said, are we so egocentric that we would think that people have not been healing long before there were psychologists? And that's the reality. It is that people have been healing long before therapy was a concept. So figure out other ways folks have been healing and how can you incorporate that in your practice? Think about the ways you heal and how can you incorporate that in your practice? Whether it's, you know what, client, you've been feeling really stuck with some behavioral activation. What do you say we just walk while we do therapy, or go sit in a park and do therapy if it's safe to do so, and really allowing yourself to not only meet the client where they're at, but meet yourself where you're at, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, that's the new chapter. It's the new chapter that we really need to walk into in the mental health field.
Yeah. And thinking about healing versus coping, and thinking about healing as not just being, let's talk about your experiences, but actually, what can we do? Maybe it's, I'm going to connect you to a nonprofit organization, and even we walk over if it's close by, right? And those things, or maybe we have somebody come from the organization to meet you after a session, and thinking about ways in which we can step beyond just coping with symptoms and really moving people to the life they want.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for that, Jose. It's so beautiful. I really want to acknowledge you for the incredible work you're doing, touching people's lives and changing lives and systems and communities. I'm grateful to know you. I hope I get to meet you again, and just really sharing with people that there is a way that they can tell their story and then do something with it. And for people out there who are listening and they want to do that, can they come to your organization? How can they start to learn what this is about radical healing and creating change in their lives and in their communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you for your kind words. And the thought I was having was, I'm also really lucky that I have an incredible team of really passionate people and people in my life that not only see the work I'm doing, but make space for the fact that I'm going to be traveling and I'm going to be doing this work and that it's an important part of who I am. And so I'm only as strong as my community. And yes, absolutely, that community is welcoming and people can join us at any time. The easiest ways is to follow us on social media at the Phoenix Empowered, or you can email me directly. My email is connect@thephoenixempowered.org. And like I said, we have a blog that we're always asking people if they want to contribute to. We're also open to other ideas. We want to start to really do some community-based work, community spaces, virtual programming. So if you have something that you're thinking would be really important and could be a way people could heal, please do reach out and let's dream together. Let's play together. Welcome to our family is what I like to say.
Oh, so generous. Thank you so much for that. We'll link to all of these connections in the show notes. Don't forget about José's podcast, The Phoenix Unbound, that's coming up. And I'll also link to the TEDx talk because that's really great too.
I haven't seen it, but I'm glad you think so. I won't watch my own talks.
Really? That's so funny. That's great. Well, exactly. And so there, we are being real. And that's such at the heart of this and of healing.
Yeah.
Thank you again for everything you're doing. It's been a true pleasure. Thank you to our listeners. And until next time, remember to keep it simple and keep showing up. Thanks for listening to A Simple Therapy podcast. If today's episode resonated with you, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who needs it. Your support means so much. You can learn more or get in touch at asimpletherapypodcast.com. And remember, let's keep it simple and keep showing up.